This is lesson 8. It's actually called literal equations or solving equations with more than one variable. So first we want to look at, we've been doing a lot of inverse property. Same thing applies here. So let's just start with a simple one. We're going to have two different variables, 2x plus y. On the other side of the equation, I'm just going to put an x minus 2y. Okay, so first thing you have to recognize is now we actually have two different variables. Here we have the x's that we have to deal with, that's in red, and in blue we have y's that we're going to have to deal with. Now, we cannot combine both of those terms because they're not the same terms. They have two different terms. One has x, one has y. When you're combining like terms, always keep in mind that you have to do they have to look exactly the same, either be an integer or if the x or it has a y. So, but what we can do is between the two is between the equal sign. So the equal sign is the great kind of is a wall. It's kind of a divide. In order to get what the inverse property allows us to do is, in order to get something from, let's say, the right side of the equation to the left side of the equation, we actually have to do the opposite. That's what the inverse tells us. So let's first deal with the x here. So in order for, this is a positive x because there's no negative in front of it. So in order for us to get this positive x over to the 2x, we have to do the opposite of positive. Since we know this is a positive, we are doing a negative x. What those two things is that cancels out. We subtract the x from what is actually x. Now, let's bring this down here. 2x minus 1x is going to be just x plus y equals negative 2y. Okay, so far so good on this one. Now let's deal with the next things we have to deal with. Now we have two y's. We have to get the y's equal. And let's say for this one specifically, we're going to solve for x. We solve for x. What this tells us is that this variable here, x, has to get by itself. That's our goal. We want to get that variable all the way to itself. So we already have an isolated x. Now we have to get rid of this y here. Since this is a positive y, we're going to do a negative y. Those cancel out. Now we're going to do a negative y right here. We're left with x equals negative 3y. And in this specific instance, because we were solving for x specifically, this is your answer, the whole thing. You cannot go any further because we don't know what x equals. We also don't know what y equals. Now, let's say we're here and now we want to actually solve for y. Let's say we want to isolate y off of this variable in particular. So now we have x equals negative 3y. If we want to solve, this tells you that this is actually negative 3 times, we all know there's a times right there, y. The opposite of times is divide. Divided by negative 3, we're dividing by negative 3 here. Our answer, x divided by negative 3 equals y. And that would be if we solved for y. So that's that specific answer. So let's look at another example here. Let's build a little more complication into it. So let's just start with 4 plus, let's go 2x minus 4y equals 6 minus 6x plus 2y. Okay, so this one's obviously a lot more complicated. And let's say with this one, we're actually going to try and solve for y. Solve for y. What this means is we're trying to get y by itself. This whole equation all has to equal y. So let's deal with the different terms that we have here. Here we have an integer, we have x's. I'm going to circle the plus x. I'm going to circle the minus x here. And then last we have the y's that we have to deal with. Y here and a y here. So we have three different things, three different inverses that are going to take place in this one. I'm always going to start with one step at a time. Okay? So let's move the 4. Let's start with just the integers here. So we know this is a positive 4. The opposite of a positive is going to be negative 4. We can only take this negative away from the other integer. That's actually what's happening here. Subtracting there. So now we have these cancel. We're rewriting 2x minus 4y equals 2 minus 6x plus 2y. Okay, so there's your first step. Now let's deal with our x's. This time I'm actually going to move the x from over this side to this side. I always talk about how I like to keep things positive. Doesn't have to, there's no set way whether you're going to move it to the left or to the right. It's just which way you see it. In this instance, I'm going to add the 6 plus 6x plus 6x. Okay, now we're left with 8x minus 4y equals, we canceled here, now we're left with 2 plus 2y. Okay, so far so good. Now let's deal with the 4y. We're moving 4y here, plus 4y plus 4y. Here we're left with 8x equals 2 plus 6y. Okay? Now we're so far so good. We have to actually take this 2 and move it back over to this side because our goal is we're trying to isolate this y. We're trying to get this y by itself. So doing the opposite of a positive, negative. Now what you're doing, you're taking this whole equation here and subtracting 2. Plus a negative 2. So this whole thing would look like this. 8x minus 2 equals, and we're left with 6y. These canceled. So, see how we moved this from here? Okay. Now all that's left, then we know that 6 is multiplied by y. So we have to divide 6. And what is actually happening is this whole equation here is all, so this is all one statement together. All of that gets divided by 6. So it's not just the 8x, it's also the negative 2. So now we're left with 8x minus 2 equals y. This is all divided by 6. So we've isolated the variable. So this would be something we can do, but something we can actually notice here is you can reduce this. You can actually reduce this because all of these are divisible by 2. So 8 divided by 2 goes to 4x. 1 divided by 2 actually is 1, and 6 divided by 2 becomes 3. This answer becomes 4x minus 1 all over 3 equals y. And we solved for y. So the big thing that you always have to remember is when you're adding or subtracting variables, you have to add and subtract together. Now, and then once we get to this step, you're actually dividing by the entire whole because this is all one expression here. So that's the big thing to remember as you're going through these things. Always take it one step at a time. And then once you get to this point where it's just an integer and a variable next to each other, you're dividing that entire thing by the entire statement here.